Hello, I'm John Vos, Senior Lecturer Emeritus in the Department of Communication. In 1992, the UC Davis Faculty Emeriti Association established a video records project to create an archive of oral history about the Davis campus. In this academic year, 2012-2013, we begin the 21st year of interviewing distinguished emeritus faculty, as well as leaders from the campus administration and staff. Through the hard work and persistence of a number of volunteers, the Video Records Project, which is now co-chaired by Alex McKella and Bill Breidenbach, has continued providing an important history of both the UC campus and its people.
This interview is with Cruz Reynoso of the UC Davis School of Law. He is Professor Emeritus and was holder of the Buchever and Bird Endowed Chair in the law school. Professor Cruz's academic career has included professorships at other universities prior to coming to UC Davis in 2001. He retired at Davis in 2007. He is a former Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court, and before that he served as an Associate Justice of the 3rd District Court of Appeal. He has also worked as a special counsel for a number of private law firms. Professor Cruz's awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which he received in the year 2000. He has also been given a Distinguished Public Service Award from UC Davis in 2002, and he was awarded the UC Davis Medal in 2007. Professor Cruz is interviewed here by his friend and colleague, Kevin Johnson, Dean of the School of Law.
Pleasure being here with you here this morning.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family and your upbringing and your background?
Be happy to. I was born in the middle of the Depression in 1931, but I always emphasize that I didn't cause it. And grew up in a little town called Brea, then little town in Orange County, 3,000 or 4,000 people at that time. In fact, I even checked the census for 1930, and there were about 3,000 or 4,000 people at that time. Now in Orange County, probably 100,000 people. And I grew up there for the first 7 years of my life. And so we had a interesting upbringing because we spoke nothing but Spanish at home since my folks had immigrated here from the state of Jalisco, an area called Los Altos de Jalisco, or the highlands of Jalisco. And so we spoke nothing but Spanish at home, but nothing but English outside of home because there were only 3 or 4 Mexican families in town. So we really grew up bilingually. We had good neighbors. I remember they gave us the comics every Sunday, so we read the comics on Sundays at least. And apparently I learned English very well, perhaps too well, because when I was in the 1st grade, there was a little girl who was stumbling over a word she was trying to read, and the teacher was there trying to guide her. And I was standing nearby. I thought I was doing her a favor when I read the word for her. But the teacher was very mad at me. Obviously, I had interfered with her teaching, so she sent me to see the principal. I was so scared about seeing the principal that I did not. I went out and waited outside the building, and when a little buddy of mine came out, we ran home as fast as we could. The next day, we went to school, and she never said anything. She just assumed I had gone to see the principal, but I had not. So we had I think, a nice life in Brea. At age 7, we moved to a barrio, a small barrio, perhaps 50, 60 homes, populated entirely by Mexican or Mexican-American families, except for one African-American family. And that was about a mile or so from the downtown of La Habra, again in Orange County. So my life changed quite dramatically from being in a community that was mostly English-speaking to a community that was entirely Spanish-speaking. And then we found some realities of California. I had 2 older brothers and I, who were then in school. We looked for a place that looked like a school. We found one. We went to sign up in the fall. We were told, no, we didn't go to that school. We went to another school, a school called Wilson. And so we went to that school. We saw that everybody there was Mexican American or Mexican. So we asked why we were being sent to that school, and we were told we were being sent to that school to learn English. Since we already knew English, we were a little bit suspicious, and then we noticed that there were homes that abutted on the school, populated by Anglo-American families, and those kids were being sent to a distant school. So we ended up being in a segregated school through the 6th grade. And so that was quite a different experience, I think. And then at that school, if kids did well, they got harassed by the other kids. If they did poorly, they got harassed by the other kids. So I tried very hard to stay right in the middle. And I succeeded to a large extent until I think the 5th grade. And all of a sudden, I got good grades. And I think it's because I ran into a series of books. I remember one of a merchant marine who had great adventures all over the world, and others about dinosaurs and so on. So I did well. So the kids started harassing me. A big insult was to call a kid a profe. And that, of course, short for professor. That was supposed to be a big insult. So they called me a profe, and I can't tell you how many fights I had protecting my honor. But then an important thing happened, though. For 1 year, I think I was in the 4th grade, we had one Mexican-American teacher, and a male, and he took us to a basketball game at the local community college and spent time with us. And I remember thinking to myself, well, you know, maybe I'd like to be a teacher someday. And I just mentioned that because I don't know whether I knew that that you needed to go to college to be a teacher or not. But I've tried to figure out why, in that segregated environment, I decided that I wanted to do something with my education. And I know that by the time I was in junior high, I had decided to go on to college. And the reason I remember that is that we were, during the Second World War, my dad was a farm worker, though actually during the Second World War he worked building ships for a little while. But he figured that we as a family, because I ended up with 5 brothers and 5 sisters, we could earn more money working in the fields of the Central Valley. So we'd go to the Central Valley, and we did all kinds of things, from topping onions to thinning tomato fields. But basically, we spent a lot of time picking plums and grapes, the grapes that then are turned into raisins. And on one occasion, I asked the field foreman what he when we would be done with the season. And he says, why are you asking? I said, well, because we always get back late. We've got to work doubly hard to catch up. And he says to me, well, you're the first Mexican kid I ever talked to who was interested in education. I remember having 2 thoughts. One, he never talked to Mexican kids about education. And 2, it made me so mad that I told myself, someday I'm going to look him up, and I'm going to have my college degree in my left hand. I'm going to poke him in the nose with my right. Well, of course, I never did that. But that's why I remember that early on I decided that I wanted to go to college. And I mentioned that because of the boys that were in my segregated class. None of them graduated from high school except for me. There were 2 girls, I believe, who did, but none of the boys did, because there was an expectation in those days, both by the Anglo-American community and by the Mexican-American community. The boys would quit school at age 16 and start working in the orange groves of Orange County. And I had different ideas. So that's what brought me, I think, to wanting to go on to college and eventually become a lawyer.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about your college years?
Yes, I went, in those days, Orange County was so different. When we after graduating from the segregated school, which only went up to the 6th grade, we went to an integrated junior high, 7th and 8th grade. Then from there we went to high school, and the high school was in Fullerton. The annual of Fullerton is called the Pleiades, after the constellation of 7 stars, because I think at that time, or maybe before, 7 communities sent their students to Fullerton, and La Habra was one of those communities. So we went to high school in Fullerton, and then I went to Fullerton Community College. I was elected, I think, vice president of the senior class in high school, but then in the community college, we had people coming from different high schools, and and I had taken a course on speech, and apparently there was a practice at that time to have the speech teacher or professor recommend somebody to be in charge of the first meeting of the freshman class. And so he recommended me. Apparently he had liked some of my talks. I remember I had a chalk talk on cartoons, and at that time I actually wanted to be an artist. So in fact I worked for a commercial artist at that time. And so I was in charge of that first meeting. So I think because they didn't know anybody else, when I called for nomination, somebody said, well, I'll nominate you. So I ended up being nominated and elected president of the freshman class, and then logically I ran for the student body presidency, and I was elected as to that. We had a dean of men who was really quite a marvelous person. After that he became the president of several community colleges and actually worked establishing a community college. I spent a lot of time with him and got to know him well, and he got to know me. Perhaps because of that, later he confirmed what I had suspected, that he invited the dean of Pomona College to come meet me. I had expected that I would go on to a public institution because I had no money. The dean of men of Pomona College came out. We spent 2 or 3 hours talking, most of the afternoon. At the end he said, well, Cruz, if you apply to Pomona College and you get admitted, we'll give you a full scholarship. So I applied, and I got admitted, and I got the scholarship, so I graduated from Pomona College. Then when I graduated from Pomona College, the Korean War was still on, though it was apparently winding down at that time. At any rate, I was a draftee, so I called the draft board and told them that I wanted to be drafted. We were called volunteer draftees. I wanted to get into the military during the summer so I could get out 2 years after that, also during the summer, to continue my education. By that time, excuse me, sometime late high school, early college, I had decided that rather being an artist, and I had been recommended by my art teacher to her husband, who was a commercial artist, and I worked with him through high school and college. So apparently I had some talent along those lines, but I had decided to be a lawyer because I saw a lot of injustices around me, and I wanted to do something about that. Indeed, one time my parents needed a lawyer. They spoke no English, and we couldn't find one Spanish-speaking lawyer in all of Orange County. So I figured there was work to be done. So I knew that I wanted to go to law school by the time I was at Pomona College. So I tried to get good grades and so on. And so indeed, a friend of mine and I went to volunteer for the military, and we were interviewed by a lady in charge of that office. And after interviewing us, she said, well, I'm going to take Mr. Reynoso, but I'm not going to take you, he said to my friend, because you haven't finished college. You go back and finish college, and then you can volunteer, be a volunteer draftee. And what we didn't realize was that the armistice was signed only a couple of months after I went into the Army, and I think there have been discussions already so that the need for soldiers had been going down. So then I was in the Army for a couple of years, and several of us in basic training were asked whether or not we wanted to be in the counterintelligence corps. That sounded better than carrying an M1 rifle in Korea. An older brother of mine had been in the thick of the fighting in Korea because he was already a paratrooper when the war broke out. So we exchanged letters, and I'm sorry I didn't keep him about war. And he spoke about the horrors of seeing being people killed, smelling dead horses, the smell of bombs bursting, and all that sort of thing. So anyway, several of us said, yeah, we'd like to be counterintelligence corps agents. And so we were sent to Baltimore, Maryland to be trained. I should tell you that during my high school and college years, with the Joseph McCarthy era, where anybody who was politically liberal was accused of being a communist. I always believed in civil rights, so I had to go through a lot of fights in protecting what I believed in during that time. And indeed, it even happened in the counterintelligence corps training. On one occasion, a lieutenant was praising Joseph McCarthy and what he was doing. I couldn't stand it anymore. Finally, I got up and disagreed with everything he was saying. And all my buddies said, well, we'll see you in Korea, because if they thought you were a suspicious person, you'd be cut out and be sent to Korea. But apparently the lieutenant must have thought that I was kidding, because nothing happened. I graduated. And I asked to be sent abroad. I said, even if it's Korea. But as the military does so often, most of my buddies wanted to stay in the U.S. So they sent me to Washington, D.C., and most of my buddies to Korea. In Washington, D.C., then, we dressed as civilians and did mostly background checks of folk who applied for jobs to be in the military, civilian jobs. But we also did, I remember, a security review with the White House and did some other things. So when I did get out 2 years later, and I went to law school, I had applied to what I thought were all the law schools in California: UCLA, Stanford, and Berkeley. Fortunately, I was admitted to all of them, but I decided to go to Berkeley. I knew nothing about Berkeley. All I knew is that it was cheap, and so I could afford going there, and it was in Northern California. I had spent all my life in Southern California, so I figured it was time for change. So that's where I went to law school.
Well, you were one of the few Chicanos in your class at UC Berkeley Law School, weren't you?
Moderately few. I was the only one. In fact, nowadays, students ask me if I belong to the La Raza Students Association. I tell them, well, if I had, I would have been the president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer, because I was the only one in my class. And in fact, there was none other in the following class. In the class after that, the freshman class, there was one Latino. And I understand that was the norm. That is, there was one at most. So, in fact, we only had, I think, about 3 women in my class. So we went through 3 years of schooling there. I didn't like law school. I used to refer to it as a cadet atmosphere, because I had just gotten out of the military. They would seat us all alphabetically, and they would routinely ask us, now talk about case so-and-so. So we talk about the facts and the holding. Then we would be thanked, and we'd go to the next person. They would do the same thing. So it wasn't very imaginative. But fortunately, things went well for me. My main goal was to get grades good enough to have a good chance to pass the bar the first time. That was my goal. I knew that matters were uncertain. In fact, I had read some books entitled A Lawyer to His Son, and they talked about law school and how you never knew whether you'd do well in law school or not. So when I went there, I was prepared with alternatives. If I didn't do well, I was considering studying some other matters. Fortunately, I did well enough to stay in school. And I knew in my first year there, a person who had graduated very near the top of his class had failed the bar the first time. So I knew that even that was uncertain. But again, fortunately, things went well for me. I got a fellowship after law school to study Mexican constitutional law. Meanwhile, incidentally, I had gotten married during the time that I was in law school to a young woman I had met in Washington, D.C. So she and I went to Mexico for 6 months to study Mexican constitutional law at the National Autonomy University. Then came back and started practicing.
Now, where did you, I do want to get to your time at UC Davis, but where did you practice law? Because you had quite a career before you came to UC Davis.
Well, that's true. Well, I started, I called the dean of the law school to see who was hiring in small towns. I wanted to be a small town lawyer. And he gave me a list of several places, and one of them was in Imperial Valley. So we went to Imperial Valley, met with a lawyer there, then went to another small town called Beverly Hills. As my wife and I were going up this big elevator, we said, this is not quite what we had in mind. I think the dean was just looking at population. Then went to Bakersfield, then went to Sacramento. The job in Imperial Valley was to be an assistant to the state senator half-time and practice law in his firm half-time. And that seemed like an attractive alternative to me because I had always been interested in public service. On our way to Santa Cruz for an interview, my wife and I decided we would accept the job in Imperial Valley, so started practicing law in Imperial Valley. And was there on and off for about 11 years. Took leave of absence to serve with the state of California, took another leave of absence to serve with the federal government. After I had, my practice had grown, so I had some attorneys to help in my office. And I continued doing that. until I went to Washington, D.C. One of the jobs I had accepted with the state was working with what was then called the Fair Employment Practices Commission. In Washington, they obviously were looking for lawyers who had some experience in that regard, and so they called and asked if I would go to Washington, D.C. to be interviewed by a new chair. They were willing to pay for my family and me to go back there, so we went back there after a few months and got in and were interviewed. And something funny happened. The chair, when I was chatting with him, looked at me. He says seriously, "Now, Mr. Reynoso, would a person like me be called an Anglo in California?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Chair, you'd be referred to as an Anglo in California." He said, "Can you imagine me, a good Jewish boy, being called an Anglo?" So apparently there are differences, geographic differences on what people are called. So I worked with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for a year and a half or two. Meanwhile, the law the campaign against poverty by President Johnson had started. I had met with a gentleman who later applied for and got actually the first large grant for legal services in California called California Rural Legal Assistance. And he had asked me to be the chair of the board because I had been in touch with him beforehand. I was a chair. Cesar Chavez and others were members of that board. But I quit, obviously, when I went to Washington. I started getting phone calls asking if I wouldn't join CRLA. I was quite reluctant to give up my law practice that I had been building by that time for 10, 12 years. But eventually I decided to join CRLA and became its director for 4 years.
So you moved to Sacramento, or?
We actually moved to the Bay Area. The main office for CRLA at that time, administrative office, was in San Francisco. And so we actually ended up, we didn't realize we ended up in Piedmont, which is a very wealthy community. We thought we were in Oakland. So I used to tell people, because our house was not that great, that we were in the slums of Piedmont. I was there 4 years. It was a wonderful, wonderful time in my life where we were able to do a lot of good things. And legal services were very popular. When I'd go and lecture before law students, like 90% of them wanted to work for legal services. At any rate, I was called by Berkeley to teach a seminar on poverty law. Then later, I was called by UCLA to do the same thing, and discovered that I rather enjoyed teaching at the law school level. So then I started getting invitations by law schools from all over the country asking if I wanted to teach. And I got a particularly interesting one from New Mexico. They said, "We've heard good things about you. We'd like to pay your way to come here to meet us. It's not a recruitment because we don't have an opening now, but we'd like to see what you think of us and what we think of you," basically. I did make that trip. 6 or so months later, they wrote again saying, "Well, we now have an opening." They offered me a job. By that time, we had ended successfully a large tough campaign against Governor Ronald Reagan, who under the law was permitted to veto programs. There were poverty programs, and he vetoed our program because he didn't like poverty lawyers, he didn't like what we were doing for poor people, and so on. And so we had about a 2-year battle. Richard Nixon was then the president, and eventually we were refunded. It's a long, complicated way that we got there. And so things were peaceful at CRLA after all those years, and I figured that if I was ever going to leave, that was a good time to leave. I chatted with the board, they agreed, and so I accepted the position in New Mexico, and that was the beginning of my teaching in law schools.
And being a profe.
Yeah, being a profe, finally.
And you had a
and the students would call me profe with an aura of respect.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be called profe, not get beat up.
Right.
Now, you had a family at this time when you moved to New Mexico, didn't you?
Yes, no, by the time we went to New Mexico, I actually had 4 children, 2 girls, 2 older girls, and a boy. The boy actually was very young, but shortly after we got to New Mexico, just a few months later, our 4th child was born. So I refer to him as a manito, a person who's from New Mexico is a manito. So I would tell people that I was part manito because my son was born in New Mexico. And that really was the number of children that we had. We ended up with 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. And of course, their first years were in New Mexico, but then I was there just 4 years, and we moved back to California. We moved back to California because we had a new governor by the name of Jerry Brown, and he greatly admired legal services lawyers. Many of his top administrators were legal services lawyers, including several from CRLA. So on one occasion, his appointment secretary called and told me that the governor wanted to appoint me to a high executive position, and I told him I couldn't accept because I was in the middle of a semester, and so I figured that was pretty well it because he called back several times. But to my surprise, he called again a few months later and says, "Well, the governor says if you can't accept a position now or as administrator, can you accept a judicial position?" And I asked, "What did you have in mind?" He said, "Court of Appeal." I said, "When would I have to report?" He said, "It doesn't matter." I said, "How about next summer?" He says, "Okay." So that's how I became a judge. And I was appointed to the 3rd District Court of Appeal in Sacramento, one of several districts in California. After being there for about 6 years, the governor then appointed me to the California Supreme Court, where I served for about 5 years.
And you were the first Latino on the California Supreme Court, correct?
I was the first Latino appellate judge. I was the first Latino on the Supreme Court. Yes, somehow, much has to do with history. And I happen to have the qualifications, I guess, at a time when a person like Jerry Brown wanted to see a little bit more diversity in the judiciary, and so I seem to be a logical person for him to appoint me. So while people view that as some important accomplishments on my part, a lot depends on history and what's going on, not just on personal worth, as you know. At the Supreme Court, and persons have to be confirmed by the voters. So I was confirmed by the voters when I was on the Court of Appeal, and I was confirmed by the voters when I went to the Supreme Court. But then a terrible campaign against the then Chief Justice Rose Bird was launched by some folk. And the campaign against her seemed to be going so well that they decided to add a couple of other judges that they wanted not on the court. And I think it was based on the fact that the court for 50 years had been a court very solicitous of the law, of the workers. For example, Ronald Reagan had appointed, had broken a long tradition of appointing both labor people and business people to the Workers' Compensation Board. And so the board, now having all people from industry, started issuing rulings that clearly were unlawful. That is, the law specifically said that the law was to be interpreted in favor of the workers. And so the Supreme Court took a case and overturned it and wrote that it would keep an eye out for workers' comp cases that the court never took. So it had a long tradition of protecting consumers, protecting minorities. It had ruled, one of the first courts to rule that it was unconstitutional to set aside a statute that allowed blacks, for example, allowed anybody to buy a house irrespective of race or ethnicity. And so I think, and particularly the insurance industry, I think, was not happy with the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court had ruled, for example, that if an insurance company loses a case that they should not have, they actually have to pay attorney's fees and so on. So a lot of business money, particularly insurance money, came into a campaign to not have us continue in our positions. And so 3 of us were removed from the court.
Did you campaign at all in your defense, really?
I was very reluctant to establish any committee, I must say. I just viewed it as in Congress for the role of a judge. But I was convinced maybe 6 months before the election that I should. And frankly, I was surprised that in a short time we were able to raise about $1 million. But that means nothing in California. So we weren't able to go on television or anything of that sort. So we left the court. When we left the court, then I started practicing law with a firm in Los Angeles. They set up an office for me in Sacramento. But then after a while, UCLA, the dean of UCLA called and asked if I would be interested in teaching again. And I had enjoyed teaching, so I told her yes. And eventually I was then joined the faculty at UCLA. I continued as special counsel with the law firms, but really my main job was to be a professor. And I enjoyed that. I was there 10 or 11 years. And then I got a call from a place called UC Davis. And UC Davis had a new academic chair for the study and teaching of freedom and equality. And I was offered that chair. And I thought, boy, you know, what lawyer could say no to a chair like that? Now, my wife had not wanted to move to Los Angeles, so I actually had a little apartment. I would fly down on Mondays and fly back on Thursdays. I would tell people that I was a legislator in reverse, because they would fly up on Monday and fly back on Thursday. And there was an associate dean at the law school at that time, who must have been a wise guy, because he said that the reason I was offered a job at Davis was that like the old immigration service, the law school believed in family reunification. I was going to be reunified with my family. Do you remember who that associate dean was?
I think I do know. A very wise man.
Yeah.
Later became the dean of the law school.
Dean Johnson.
Well, what year was that when you did come to UC Davis?
I think it was 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I was full-time at Davis only for about 6 years. I think it was 2007, about that time, when I went emeritus. And I went emeritus early because my wife had cancer, and we didn't know how long she would live, and I wanted to spend time with her. And then sadly, she died. And ironically, on the day that shortly after we had retired, she and I were planning a trip to Tennessee, where she was from, and we actually bought a small van that we were going to drive. And a doctor called. She was being treated by the cancer center at UCLA, and told her how sick she was, and recommended that she transfer her care to Sacramento. And sad to say, she only survived another 6 months. So as soon as I could, I continued my teaching at UC Davis, Professor Emeritus, teaching 2 courses that I had been teaching before, one remedies and one legal ethics, and continued doing that for several years. And then the professor who normally taught legal ethics, who had become the dean, returned to teaching, and so then I continued, and today I continue teaching a course on remedies. So even though I've been emeritus now for longer than I was full-time, I've continued to be associated with the law school, and have really enjoyed that relationship.
Have you liked teaching students at UC Davis School of Law?
Well, one of the things that I have always, UCLA is a great law school, but one of the many reasons I was interested in Davis was that it was a smaller school, where we have smaller classes, where you get to know the students better, and it's amazing that students actually enjoy law school, because as I say, when I went to law school, I didn't really enjoy law. I enjoyed the study of law, but I didn't enjoy law school as such. And to have students here at Davis who tell me they actually enjoy law school, it's a great pleasure for me. The other thing that's different really from the other 2 schools where I've taught is the activity of students. My goodness, I remember talking to a student who said that he thought he could go the whole semester never buying food, because there's so many lectures, and food is often provided with those lectures. It seems to me that we have lectures, outside lectures, or professors lecturing practically every noon hour, and the students are very active. And very inclusive. For example, one of the largest and most active groups is the La Raza Law Students Association. But not all the members are actually Mexican or Mexican American. There are many who simply believe in the good work that the student is doing. And I noticed that the Association of Black Law Students has members that are not black, but are there helping the organization. So it's been a very inclusive community, and so I've not only enjoyed my teaching, but I've joined the ambiance, the atmosphere in the law school.
What have you been working on in terms of research over the years?
Well, I actually continued a long, several-year research project that I had studying the work a number of Latino lawyers in California, and published a long article in terms of my findings after I came to Davis. And that's really the only substantial piece of work that I did. Besides that, I've written op-ed pieces on education and immigration, and delivered many lectures and so on. So I've been a little bit too busy.
I understand you're working on an autobiography.
Well, sort of an autobiography, because I'm commenting on matters as I go along. It's not just relating factually what happened. So, in writing, for example, of my upbringing, I mentioned what I think helped me be who I am. The dedication that my dad, who was basically a farm worker, had to his work, and he was proud of his work. He just didn't view himself as a farm worker. He viewed himself as a person who was helping feed the country and feed the world. Or my mother, who was a tough lady, but I remember that they come from an area of Mexico. I think I mentioned to you that's more Catholic than the Pope. It's said, and.
It's pretty Catholic.
Yes, very Catholic, and we were taught the catechism when we were kids, and on Saturdays when we were still small in Brea, she would be hanging clothing out to dry, and if we failed to answer correctly to a catechism question, instead of pinning using the pin for the next piece of clothing, she would put it on our ears, and it hurt, and it was a very effective way of teaching. We learned. So I think. Well, or even more important, it seems to me, I remember that hobos used to come to the house all the time to be fed, and she would put on a great meal for them, tortillas, carnitas, frijoles, arroz, the whole thing. And we would complain to her that she fed the hobos better than she fed us, and she wouldn't deny it. She said, you know, we're lucky that we have a dad who actually works full-time. We refer to him as a trabajador de planta, a full-time worker. And so he says, we're lucky that your dad is working full-time. We have a roof over our head, clothing on our shoulders, and food on the table, and we have a duty to share with others. And I think all of those things really buttress what my thoughts are. Or even when we were picking plums one time in the Central Valley near Fresno, on one occasion, we used to be paid by the number of boxes that we'd fill of the plums. And the whole family would be working out there, all the children and so on. And there was a murmur, and I couldn't quite tell what was going on. And all of a sudden, everybody stopped working. It was a sit-down strike, and I weaved my way to a group of men that were together, and then I saw the field foreman coming down. The same field foreman who talked about Mexican kids and education came down. And I still remember that when he got to that group of men, the first question he asked was, all right, who started this? Not what's the problem, but plums have to be picked. And apparently we were being paid less than other growers were paying their folk. And so it didn't take very long, I think, for the grower to decide that he was going to pay us the same amount. And what has stayed with me is the power that people have when they work together. Had any one person complained, they would have been fired, but working together was strength. So I think a lot of those things that you pick up as a youngster stay with you, and I think those things have stayed with me.
Are you going to write at all about your run for public office in Imperial Valley?
Oh, I am indeed. I ran for the assembly, actually, in Imperial County when I was a young lawyer, and nobody gave me a chance. I was the first Latino to run for a district-wide office, and my opponent was the mayor of the second largest town, so everybody assumed that he would win, and by golly, we won with about 60% of the vote. So all of a sudden, people started paying attention. But we were running against an incumbent, so we didn't make it. And also, this was 1964, but believe it or not, I was red-baited. I was probably the only one who knew more about communism than anybody else in Imperial Valley, but I was red-baited, and eventually I didn't win. I tell people that, but I learned so much running for office. I tell people that everybody ought to run for public office at least once in their lifetime, and if they're lucky, they'll lose. But they'll have the treasure of learning what you learn. I ran into organizations and people that I had lived by that time several years in Imperial County, but I met new people, new organizations, and really had sort of a sense of awe in terms of the responsibility of a representative to truly represent such great variations in interests and peoples and so on. So I think it was a great training for me, and I think it made me more realistic. Years later, when I was on the Court of Appeal, I was appointed by President Carter to work on a commission dealing with immigration and refugee policy. From that came the change in the law in 1986 that permitted many to become legalized, quote unquote. And I still remember that after studying, we had a big staff. We studied programs all over the world. And eventually we were ready to make recommendations. And the chair said, all right, we've studied this for 2 or 3 years. I forget how long. It's time to start voting. And the first issue, he says, is this. And we have 2 options, and gave us the 2 options. The commission was made up of 4 citizens, and I was one of the citizens, 4 congresspeople, 4 senators, and 4 members of the cabinet. I turned to the fellow next to me, who happened to be a congressman, and I said, I don't like either option. He says, welcome to the legislative process. So I think that's influenced my thinking even on legislation, even if it doesn't do the things that I wanted to do. If it's a step forward, I think it's a good thing to take. So I think all of those experiences, I think, end up making a person who he is, if you will.
Well, you've received many honors and accolades for all the wonderful things you've done. What particular honor means the most to you?
Well, the one that has meant most, really, is the Presidential Medal of Freedom that I received from President Clinton, in part because it's said to be the highest civilian honor that a person can receive. But at UC Davis, I've been very fortunate to have received, for example, the UC Davis Medal, which at that time I understood had only been awarded to 7 people in the whole history of the campus. So that was very special for me. And incidentally, that may have contributed to a lady making a movie of my life, because she said that she came to that occasion when I was being honored, and there were so many people there. She said, well, maybe people will come to see a movie of his. And so she made a movie of my life. And before that, I had received the Distinguished Award for Public Service. So I've received 2 awards here at Davis that have been very special to me.
Did you get to meet President Clinton?
Oh, yes. Well, what happened was that I had been appointed to be on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights by the Senate, and the term was for 6 years. And then by the time that term was coming to an end, the Republicans were actually in charge of the Senate. So the president wasn't sure that they would honor the unstated agreement they had that there would be so many folk appointed by Democrats, so many folk appointed by Republicans. So he called the chair and me and asked if it was all right if he would reappoint us rather than the Senate. And so he actually reappointed us, the chair and me. I was the vice chair, to the 2nd term of the U.S. at that position, being with the U.S. Attorney, with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And he was very interested. He had us come and meet with him in the White House to talk about the issues and so on. So I had occasion to meet with him several times.
What kind of work did you do on the commission?
The commission was an exciting time. When I joined, Republican appointees still had a majority. So we had a difficult time getting the commission to have the type of hearings that we thought they should have. But shortly thereafter, those appointed by the Democratic administrations had a majority in the commission. So we had hearings on the issues that Indian Americans had. Went out to Albuquerque and to the Dakotas and so on. When issues became very volatile, we had hearings in New York about the killing of, I forget the name of that African American immigrant who was shot something like 40 times.
Diallo.
Yes, and indeed the first hearing that I went to was in Los Angeles. And at that time, we were looking at 2 things: the representation of Latinos in movies, and 2, the police department. And I remember the L.A. Times ran an editorial saying, what's the commission doing here, looking at the police? They came here several years ago, made recommendations. They've been implemented. We have no problems. Shortly thereafter, the Rampart tragedy became public, where it was discovered that many cops, unfortunately, were real criminals. They were placing incriminating evidence against innocent people and so on, so much so that the DA thereafter moved to released many folk from prison, showing that in fact they were innocent of the crimes that they had been of which they had been convicted. So I was that was interesting to me also, how defensive communities are when there really are problems around, and then of course the most publicized hearings we had had to do with the Bush-Gore election in Florida. We had gotten reports that that things were not right in Florida. Even on election day, we sent a couple of investigators down there, and they called back and said things are not right here. And so we had hearings thereafter, and we were the only formal agency that did an investigation. The Justice Department didn't, Congress did not, nobody did, but our agency. And we went and found that something like 90% of the ballots that were disqualified were cast by African Americans. We found that the law in Florida says that anybody who's been convicted of a felon can never vote. But two appellate courts had said that only applies to folk who are convicted in Florida. Yet the Secretary of State had written a letter saying if anybody has been convicted, no matter where, they can't vote. And then they had commissioned a list of ex-felons, but they were asked to include anybody who might be an ex-felon, not anybody who actually was an ex-felon. So our first witness actually was a Reverend African American in a church who went to vote and had voted in the same precinct for about 20 years. He went with his wife and a grown son or daughter, I forget. And the folk there knew him. They said, "Gee, Reverend so-and-so, we're sorry you can't vote. You're not on the list. Your wife and child are, but you're not." He says, "Why?" And they said, "We don't know." And they said, "Well, let's call the main office." I guess it must have been pretty early because they called and got through to the main office. We had so many complaints that there were so many calls that nobody could get through. And then when he got through, and he says when he got through, the first question the gentleman asked was, "Sir, have you been to a courthouse lately?" And they said, "In fact, I have." He says, "In what capacity?" And he said, "Well, I was a federal grand juror." He said, "No, that's impossible." He said, "We have you listed as an ex-felon." He said, "As an ex-what?" He said, "Ex-felon." He says, "I've never been convicted of anything." And they talked over a little while. And he says, "What do I have to do to get my vote back? Do I have to sue?" And he says, "One moment, please, sir." And he went off for a couple of minutes. Then he came back and said, "Let me talk to the local registrar. We'll have him put you back on the list so you can vote." So it was just what happened was terrible. My own conclusion, incidentally, sad to say, is that there's little question in my mind that vote was stolen for the person who was later declared President of the United States. So it makes me wonder about the work that President Carter is now doing, going all over the world, showing people about how to have good elections when sometimes we don't do so well in our own country. We still have a lot of work to do, I think, to make sure that everybody can vote, that everybody's vote is counted. So that was, to me, in some ways, a sad highlight of my experience with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights.
Have you done much public service work on the UC Davis campus?
Well, I've done a lot of public service work while I've been at UC Davis. Not all of it related to UC Davis. I've been, sad to say, active in investigating the killing of a young farm worker by the police in Woodland, California. I've been very active with a group named after Mario Oviedo, who was a great civil rights lawyer, and we have a program that we're just starting now to help youngsters in grammar school as early as in the second grade, because if kids don't do well even by the second and third grade, statistics indicate that they will not do well thereafter. So I've been active with that. I just Sunday, I've been too active. Just Sunday, I spoke at a memorial service for Veterans Day, and last Friday, I spoke at a graduation at Cañada Community College. And this Friday, I'll be speaking at the graduation at the Fullerton Community College that I graduated from a few years ago down in Orange County. So I've been very active, perhaps too active.
Can you tell us a little bit about an investigation you were involved with in connection with a protest on the UC Davis campus on November 18th?
Yes. Well, even that has happened in my capacity as a professor emeritus, because that happened after I had resigned and I was teaching in that capacity. We had a sad experience here where there were protests by students, and the chancellor had decided that that protest needed to come to an end, particularly because tents had been erected on the campus, and so the police then went in to remove all the campers. During that time, some of the youngsters held hands and refused to move, and so they were pepper sprayed. Nowadays, with everybody being a camera person, many folk took camera shots of that pepper spray. The students were sitting down; they weren't of danger to anybody. So that became a worldwide episode. A friend called me from Italy saying, "Hey, what's happening at UC Davis? We just saw the pepper spraying here." And so eventually the president of the university called and asked if I would head up a task force to investigate what had happened. Well, not the president, somebody called for the president. I told him that he should double check with the president because I have a reputation for speaking my mind. And he called back and said, yes, the president still had confidence in me and wanted me to chair it. So I chaired it. And we had fortunately a very good investigating team that was hired to do an investigation. And we eventually issued a report where we found that there had been absolutely no reason for the pepper spraying. And indeed, sad to say, when police do something and it endangers them professionally or criminally, there's a tendency, I think, not to be truthful. So the first statement that came from the chief of police was they pepper sprayed because their lives were in danger. They were being threatened by the students. Well, in fact, the investigators had found dozens and dozens of folk from whom they were able to get film, and it showed that there was absolutely no danger to the police. And so we issued a report. Frankly, I was a little bit concerned because we blamed everybody. We blamed the chancellor because of her lack of proper communication and lack of being able to listen. We blamed the police chief because she didn't follow proper instructions. We blamed the lieutenants. Everybody from the highest to the lowest did things that went awry that day. And so I was quite concerned that we would just be hated by everybody. In fact, fortunately, and in fact, I've been asked to be on a committee to follow up to make sure that things go well. And in fact, it's given the chancellor the opportunity to correct many of the things that had gone awry. And fortunately, she's been doing that. So I've been pleased with what she has been doing. And actually, it's been of some help to this administration and this campus. But I was meeting with some folk from other campuses who say that this has been terribly important for other campuses in the UC system and even for other educational institutions about how they should respond to issues like this.
How many people were on the committee?
About 12. We in the law school were well represented because one of our I was the chair. One of our professors actually represented the professors at the graduate level. One of the students who represented the students at graduate schools was also from the law school, so we had 3 representatives. But we had quite a diverse, actually, group, and that we were able to reach a unanimous opinion and report, I think is one of the things that helped give it some credence and why the chancellor has been able to do the things that she's been able to do.
Is there anything that came across as particularly surprising in the investigation that you were just shocked by?
Sad to say, I've been involved in matters of police malpractice before, and so I was not surprised that the first reaction was, well, we did it because we had to do it, which turned out not to be true. The thing that I think most surprised me actually was the lack of a good procedure by the people around the chancellors to be ready to act in an emergency situation. And secondly, that somehow the people around the chancellor didn't appear not to feel free to tell the chancellor, Madam Chancellor, you're wrong on this. Let me tell you how I feel. Somehow there wasn't that easy communication. And I think that surprised me somewhat, because anybody in a leadership position has to have an atmosphere where folk can disagree. Frankly, I've always simply assumed that. In fact, while I was chair of that commission, very often a commission member would say, I would suggest something, and they would say, well, we're not sure we agree. What do you think of this? Half the time their suggestions were better than mine. So anybody in a leadership position has to be ready to listen. And it surprised me that there didn't seem to be that easy give and take among the people around the chancellor. So I thought that, one, they failed the chancellor in not pressing their views. Two, maybe the chancellor failed in not creating an atmosphere where they felt at ease in doing that. So that, to me, perhaps was the most surprising matter. But as I say, it's turned out well from the point of view that Chancellor has seen what went awry, and I think she's taking the steps to try to correct that.
We talked a little before about your involvement at the law school, and what you thought about the law school. How have you liked being a part of the UC Davis campus community as a whole?
Well, in some ways, I very much like the fact that the law school is on the campus and part of the campus. And I have appreciated, for example, the program that the campus has of encouraging professors in graduate schools to teach a freshman seminar to true freshmen, 17 and 18-year-olds. And so I've taken advantage of that several times, and I think that's been a good program, but that has brought me closer to the campus as a whole. Sad to say, I still think that I probably didn't do as much as I should have in the campus as a whole. But I think that it's good to have us be here so that, for example, have professors like our dean be a professor not only at the law school but at Chicano Studies, for example. And I think the more intercommunication we have, the better. And many of our professors, as you know, have provided leadership to the Senate and so on. I guess in the few years, because I was here just about 6 or 7 years as a full tenured professor, I wasn't as involved as perhaps I should have been. But I think it's very good to have the law school be on the campus, and to have the campus personnel, including the professors and the deans and so on, be very involved in the welfare of the university, because I think we have a lot to give.
What freshman seminars did you teach?
They've all been on areas of civil rights. Some straight civil rights, some what the law says, some on affirmative action, some of representation in the legal profession. So different aspects of civil rights.
And how have you liked the undergraduate students? They're a little different in many ways from law students.
Oh, they're very different, but they are a good representation of of those young people who are interested in government and what's going on around them, because all of the students were very interested, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have signed up for the seminar. But I used to ask them, why is it that your age group, or a little bit older, 18 to 25, has the lowest percentage of voter registration, and the lowest percentage of voting? And they would say, to me, what's still surprising, our friends don't recognize or don't see the relationship of government to their lives. These are young people in a public school at a time when public schools and universities are really suffering. I often tell folk that when I went to a community college, I paid nothing for the teaching. We bought our books, but we didn't pay any fees. When I went to law school, I paid less than $100 in fees. Now the same students pay over $50,000 in fees. We're putting the burden now on the people least able to pay, the students. And I think we really do need to get back to the master plan of California developed in the 60s, where we indicated we would have K through 12 and community college and university teach opportunities for anybody to go through in true public education. And I think we really need to get back to that. So to me, it's been of value to get to know how they're thinking, what they're thinking, and how they see the world in a university setting.
Well, we have to wrap up in a few minutes, but you mentioned something I want to follow up on. Fees for the University of California have gone up fairly substantially, both at the undergraduate level and the professional school level for a number of years. How do we go about convincing our public leaders and the public at large that more support should be given to public universities?
The public leaders will be convinced only when the public at large is convinced. And I think the public at large really doesn't understand exactly what's happening. That public education in California has been the force that made this state a great economic engine, a great educational engine, a great scientific engine. And now, sad to say, in the future we may not be that because we're not producing the people we need to produce. Thus, for example, our former Governor Schwarzenegger set up a special commission to look at the issue of engineers, because all of the universities in California, private and public, are only producing about 10,000 new engineers a year. Industry in California needs 20,000 engineers. And so I knew the chair of that committee, and I talked with him both before and after I saw the governor. And afterwards, I said, "Hey, how did the governor respond to your recommendations?" He said, "Oh, great." He says he really liked all of our recommendations, but at the end he says, "Isn't it too bad we don't have any money?" I.e., he wasn't going to do anything about it. And so, well, I just read in the paper the other day that even in the last 6 years, the support for higher education has gone down 34%, but the increase in running the education has gone up 15%, if I remember correctly. So we may be even worse off than another article I read maybe a year ago that said that 20, 30 years ago, the legislature provided 60% of all of the money to run the UC system, that now it provides 20% of the money to run the UC system. In fact, some professors jokingly call the state our biggest contributor. It's just one of many contributors. We need to get to the point where it's truly a public education, and I think it takes a lot of educating of the public, who will then put pressure on the legislators to respond. We are still a rich state in California. We can afford to have true public education, I believe.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Cruz Reynoso.
Well, thank you very much. I've appreciated not only this interview, but having worked with you for these years at UC Davis, and I think you're doing a great job as Dean of the school.
Make sure that gets on tape.
Yeah.